In last week's videos, we figured out what determines the demand curve. So at a particular price, what is my quantity demanded? And we derived some basic results about the law of demand. Demand curve is downward sloping. And we worked out what shifts the curve to the left and to the right. So an important part to understanding then what determines the equilibrium price of a good is then going to be to understand what determines supply. So we have a demand curve. Eventually we're going to want a supply curve, and to figure out where those two curves intersect, and that's going to tell us what determines the prices and quantities sold of different goods. So our next learning objective here, learning objective 5, is to figure out how sellers behave in a perfectly competitive market at least, and then we can run with that to understand equilibrium behavior. So first kind of question that I'm posing here is a bit of a trick question. Because, you ask the question, are we running out of oil? And the sort of popular response would be that yes, right? We have a finite resource of oil. And if we use lots of oil, in various manufacturing processes, we use oil. Obviously, we use oil is refined into gasoline, and we use gasoline for all sorts of uses. That with a limited quantity, it's a scarce resource like anything else. We're going to run out of oil sooner rather than later. And really, I think the answer to that question is, are we running out of oil is really no. Meaning there is a vast amount of oil available on the planet Earth, probably more than we can reasonably use. At least over, I don't know, several thousand years, 100,000 years, whatever future period you want to think of. It'd be pretty tough to use all of the oil we have. So, why is there sort of this narrative that we're running out of oil? And the answer to that is really that we're running out of cheap oil, right? So what determines how much oil is produced is the willingness of a company like ExxonMobil to go and drill and obtain that oil. And so if I drill in a location such as Saudi Arabia, it's relatively cheap to get the oil. It's not that far below the surface. The surface there is relatively easy to drill in, and we can extract the oil very cheaply. And that makes companies willing to go and extract the oil and sell it to people. Now, you go into the Arctic Circle, there's plenty of oil there, right? Probably more oil than in Saudi Arabia. Why don't we drill there? It's very expensive or difficult to get the oil out from Saudi Arabia, from the Arctic Circle. So part of the problem is not so much the total amount of the resource available, even though it is still scarce, right? As most resources are. But there's sort of an idea that we'll learn that the more of a resource you've used, the more expensive it gets to go an additional amount, right? So we can drill in the relatively cheap locations such as Saudi Arabia and have relatively cheap oil. If we want more than that, it can be possible. It's just the price is going to have to be much higher. Okay, so that's just kind of an example to set the tone, and you can kind of think back, and we'll reference back to that example of producing oil. Okay, so what we're going to learn in this section here is that the amount of a good or service that's supplied, much like with demand, is dependent on the willingness of the producer or seller to accept your payment in exchange for the good. And we'll see that's going to be very closely related to the marginal cost. Okay, so now, just some terminology, right? How much would you be willing to sell your smartphone for? So if I ask you that, think of some answer in your head, and so you say, okay, if you really wanted my phone right now, I would accept, I don't know, $150 for it, right? So at the price of $150, your quantity supplied is 1, right? So quantity supplied, we can write on this here, quantity supplied is simply the amount you're willing to supply at a particular price. Amount a seller is willing to supply at a given price. So in my example, when the price of a smartphone is $150, my quantity supplied is 1. I'm willing to give you 1 smartphone if the price is $150. Now, if the price went up to $300, I would probably get more of you to be willing to give me your smartphone, right? So I'm getting closer to the price of a new one. So maybe the quantity supplied goes up to 2 as I continue to increase the price I offer for your smartphone. If I got up to, say, $1,500, I would probably get all of you to say, yes, I will give you my current smartphone for $1,500. So the quantity supplied is going to be pretty high. Let's say 65 of you. Okay? So we think of it that way. There's a pretty natural relationship between price and quantity supplied. We're sort of drawing out a positive relationship. So if I draw this curve, much like we did with demand, I have quantity here on the horizontal axis, the price, P, on the vertical axis. And when the price is low, quantity supplied was low. But as the price went higher, so did quantity supplied. And so there's a positive relationship between the two variables. When price goes up, quantity supplied goes up with it. So what we will do in the next video is to understand a little bit about why that is true. Why is the supply curve upward sloping? It seems obvious, but we want to dig into a little bit of the details in our next video.